We'll go ahead and get started and then let any of the latecomers, I think, join us um, as, uh, as, as they might. But we try and keep things on time just because we have a limited amount of time, it turns out, and we usually have a lot to talk about. So welcome to everybody that's now on our video conference. Um, I'm Zab Johnson. I'm the Executive Director and Senior Fellow for the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. And I will sort of get us started and give a brief overview of what the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative is, and a little bit of background on what we're trying to accomplish with these NeuroBiz Now gatherings. Because we have new folks joining us every week, and so a little bit of background is always useful. And then I will briefly introduce our today's panelists and the discussion topic, and sort of overview a few sort of expectations for how we'll run the next hour and conversation. So this is, of course, our latest NeuroBiz Now gathering, and today's topic will focus on the neuroscience of wellness. Our intent is for this to be a video conference discussion that we hold every week or nearly every week. We'll see how the summer months and summer weeks proceed. But it's with the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative, where each session focuses on a topic that has neuroscience and business implications of broad interest, but that is also really relevant to current events. And the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative is really trying to bring together brain science and business in an effort to improve business, drive new discoveries and applications, and enhance the education of future leaders. So we're really thankful to be able to have this kind of an outlet during this disruptive time to really facilitate conversations that are of broad and resonant interest to a really broad community. And today, of course, we've pulled together a really fantastic group of panelists that I think you will all really enjoy hearing from, and it's diverse as we always strive for. So our first panelist is Heather Hirsch. She's the founder and CEO of Thrive Wellbeing. Our second speaker is Matt Killingsworth, who is a senior fellow at Wharton People Analytics. Stacey Bilbo, who is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Duke University, and Vera Ludwig, who is a postdoctoral fellow in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. And Michael Platt and I will serve as co-moderators. Michael Platt, of course, is the faculty director of the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative and a professor of marketing, neuroscience, and psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. And I also wanted to remind everybody that our recordings of all of our past sessions can be found on our website, and I will share that link for everybody in the chat window momentarily, right after I end speaking. So the way that these events generally start off is that I will ask and invite each of the panelists to give a bit of a background on their own work and thinking that sort of grounds the conversation to come. We really do want this to be as interactive as possible. And the best way for us to do this, given the kind of venue and the online video conferencing platform that we have, is for you to put your questions and comments into the chat window, which you'll find on the right side of your application. And when you do that, I can then take a look at what those questions are, and we can try and invite you to speak them out loud on camera if you're willing, at a time that's really that flows with the kind of conversation. But we really do want this to be conversational, if at all possible. So that's generally the way that it will be. If you do not wish to be on camera, or if you are joining us by phone, of course, phone questions and comments are perfectly fine. And if you would rather not speak them, just let me know in that chat window and I will speak them for you. So great. So today, without further ado, we'll get started. And Heather, why don't you get us started as someone who's really been active in the psychology of wellness for a long time.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is really very special, and I'm excited to be a part of this great panel. So I'm Heather Hirsch. I'm a psychologist and a well-being consultant and coach. My business is Thrive Wellbeing, and what I specialize in is supporting wellness in programs, in groups, in communities. My expertise is A lot of my expertise is in the academic setting, so with graduate and professional students, postdocs, and different offices and teams around a university. So I create workshops that support well-being, such as stress management, combating imposter syndrome, um, mindfulness, resilience. I run discussion groups to support well-being, and I also do needs assessments where I'll evaluate the wellness in a program and then support it with recommendations and talk about how to improve it. So if anybody wants to see more about what I do or read my blog posts that are related to wellness, my website is thrivewellbeing.com. Well-being is hyphenated. So I think about wellness and well-being a lot. And what I was thinking about, what I think a lot about with wellness is I think of it in 4 or 5 components. And those aspects or components are social, emotional and psychological, physical, spiritual, and financial or productive or productive. And I'm just going to briefly talk about each of those and then think briefly about how I feel like this current time we're in is really impacting everybody's wellness. So social is, we're social creatures, and our connections, our contacts with other people are really important. They're hardwired into us, as a lot of my panelists can talk about a lot more. And right now, our contact often is coming in this forum that we're in right now, this virtual video chat, which I am eternally grateful that we have. But I also find myself frustrated by it and by the lack of personal contact, and I think a lot of people are experiencing that. I heard someone talk about this format as being kind of like processed food, and that really resonated with me because it feels like it will serve some purpose, it will fill you up some, but it's nowhere as satisfying for us as if we can actually be with someone and experience them with all 5 senses, as opposed to just fractions of 2 senses. Our emotional or psychological wellness is our mood, our energy, just sort of how we're feeling in the world. Our physical wellness is obviously our health and our energy, and it's what we're doing to take care of that aspect of ourselves. So it's eating well, it's drinking water, it's not drinking too much caffeine or alcohol. And exercise is enormously, enormously important for our well-being. And I know this will come up more in our conversation, but I talk about exercise so much because it's so important for our physical and our emotional health. And also a lot of studies are showing recently incredibly important for our thinking, our creativity, and our problem solving. Our spiritual wellness is what feeds our spirit, what feeds our soul. And that can be our faith and our religion. It can be being in nature. It could be listening to or creating music or art. And then financial or productive wellness. How are we doing financially? Are we okay? What are we engaging in that's productive? Do we feel like we're contributing in some way? And the thing that I keep thinking about right now is that everything relating to wellness is muted right now. All aspects of wellness, we can do well enough. We can definitely engage in aspects of them, but everything is really muted right now. And so something I keep talking to a lot of people about is, first of all, just to be gentle and be kind to yourself right now. This is a very pervasively stressful and uncertain time that we're in. And a lot of people are talking to me about, I'm not that productive, I can't focus very well, I'm just not motivated. And I again would just say, no one is productive as they are normally pre-COVID right now. Don't expect that from yourself. And we're also having our workspace, our life space, our family space, our child space, our teaching space. All of it is in like one space right now too. And so everyone's really struggling. The people I'm speaking to are really struggling with being productive and motivated. And so I really just want to put the message out there of being kind to yourself. One more quick thing that I've been talking to a lot of people about is How do we navigate this uncertain time and keep our wellness at least as well as we can? And something I think about is I picture two hands, and I feel like I'm holding the loss and the grief in one hand and the gratitude in the other hand right now. And the loss is little losses and big losses. It's things like I can't go to a restaurant or work out at my gym. It's I can't hug my friend whose mom just passed away. And it's bigger losses of like I'm not going to this bluegrass music festival next week that I look forward to all year long and I've gone to for like 8 years. And there's many bigger losses, like people who have lost their health or lost their job or lost someone they love due to COVID. So there's big and small grief right now, but there's also so much to be grateful for, big and small again. And then I try to navigate that. And some days I do better than others. Some days I'm more in the grief and loss area, and some days I can really hold on to the gratitude. But that's something else that I've been thinking a lot about and talking to people about recently with wellness and how to navigate this really crazy, crazy, unprecedented time. So I'll stop for now and let things go from there.
Great. Thank you, Heather. So I think we'll move to Matt Killingsworth. And Matt, you've sort of taken wellness to a whole new step in the modern era, which is, to really add in the power of analytics and big data. So I think a lot of people will be really curious to hear more about that.
Definitely. Thanks, Zab, and thanks, Michael, for having me here today. It's a delight to be on this panel with all of you other folks. As Zab mentioned, I'm Dr. Matt Killingsworth. I'm a senior fellow at Wharton People Analytics. Over the past 50 years, we humans have become materially much richer. We've developed all kinds of new technology. We've made huge improvements in medical care. But paradoxically, the data on human well-being, at least in the United States, shows a trend that's basically flat. Happiness hasn't improved in the last 50 years. It hasn't declined, but it hasn't gotten any better, which strongly suggests, at least to me, that all the hard work that we're doing isn't very aligned with what actually makes us happy. I'm a scientist and researcher, and my work focuses on trying to deeply understand what happiness is and what its true causes are, so that maybe in the next 50 years, we can make more progress in improving the quality of human life. Different scientists approach the question of human happiness and well-being in different ways. Some try to understand the national conditions that make a country like Denmark happier than almost everywhere else. Other scientists look at the personality traits of happy people. In my research on happiness, I collect data on the moment-to-moment experiences that people have as they live their lives. So to do this, I created a platform called trackyourhappiness.org. Anyone who's interested can check that out. And Track Your Happiness uses smartphones to collect real-time data on people's happiness around the world. People who sign up for my study get pinged on their phones a few times a day, and then they answer some questions about their experience at that moment. Things like what they're feeling, what they're doing, and what they're thinking about. Each of those observations kind of gives me a snapshot of what a person is experiencing at that moment, and then I take a bunch of snapshots for each person so that I kind of get this composite movie image of their lives. Over a number of years of running the study, I've accumulated millions of observations, millions of snapshots from hundreds of thousands of people across hundreds of different variables. And I then use that data to try to figure out, well, what's causing some people to be happier than others? What's causing a given person's happiness to fluctuate up and down over the course of their life? And basically, I'm trying to put all of that data together to figure out sort of an overall equation for human happiness. So we can go sort of deeper in our discussion into a lot of the different points I'm sure that everyone on the panel has to offer, but I'm going to just sort of put two things that I've learned from this data on the table. And both of them, in fact, are nicely echoing some things that Heather has already mentioned. Lesson number one thing I've seen in this data is that happiness is incredibly variable. Happiness varies more from hour to hour and day to day within a single person than it varies between people, which means everyone is unhappy some of the time. And that's true even for the very happiest people. Happy people aren't in some constant state of zen or bliss. Their happiness fluctuates all over the place, just like the rest of us. And the point that I take away from this and that I would offer to you is that if sometimes you feel sad or worried or like getting through the day is a grind, that's totally, completely normal. In fact, it's probably unavoidable no matter how great your life is. And I think that's doubly important to keep in mind during a challenging time like this, sort of giving yourself the permission to be human and just the reality that sometimes life is going to be difficult. The second lesson, so I've looked across many, many, many different kinds of daily choices that people can make. And if I had to single out one thing to focus on in the pandemic, it's getting enough exercise. And my data, it's probably the most straightforward thing you can do that will have the biggest impact on your quality of life. I find that the acute benefits of exercise last about 9 hours. So exercising in the morning or the middle of the day is going to be better than doing it at night. Otherwise, you'll sleep through a lot of the benefits. I also find that those benefits scale basically linearly with how many days a week you exercise. So exercising even once a week is going to help, but doing it more often will help more. And I also find the benefits scale up with higher intensity and longer sessions. So if you want to get the sort of looking at the curves of sort of investment versus reward, I find that if you want to get sort of the most benefit in the least amount of time, you'd be doing around 30 minutes a day of pretty high intensity exercise 7 days a week. But doing anything will help. And if you don't already have an exercise habit, I would suggest setting a really small goal to start. Like, I'm going to wake up every day, I'm going to exercise for 1 minute. And probably if you do that several days in a row, you'll kind of get eager to do a little bit more, and then you can add a little bit more, but you can kind of lay this groundwork that gets you excited to build on top of it, rather than saying, I'm going to, do 2 hours, 7 days a week. I mean, no one would succeed at that if that's where they're starting. So I'll pause there. Happy to chat more about lots of other things.
Great. Thanks very much, Matt. So we'll move on to Stacey Bilbo. So Stacey is one of the leading experts on the interactions between the immune system and the brain. And I think, she'll really ground us in, I think, some of the most cutting edge ideas, especially around, stress and disease, things that we are, watching unfold over time and the impacts, across the lifespan.
Thanks, Sav, and thanks, Michael, as well, for putting together this panel. This is really great. So switching gears a little bit and diving into the more cellular, molecular area, which is where I work. I'm basically a basic neuroscientist, and I work at the interface of the nervous system and the immune system. And most broadly, I'm interested in how the cells of the immune system, both in your body and in the brain, and the chemical messengers that they produce, things like cytokines or chemokines, are important for normal brain development and function, and in turn, how immune system activation, so for instance, by infection or various environmental stressors, or even changes in diet, like poor diet versus enriched diets, and impact the brain and the neural mechanisms underlying cognitive function, mood, emotion, etc. So this is a panel on wellness, but one concept that I'm particularly interested in is actually in the collection of behavioral traits that all species exhibit when they are sick. So this is known as sickness behavior. So these are changes in motivated behavior that we all exhibit that are conserved across species and across individuals, such as social withdrawal, lack of appetite, lethargy, etc., that at first glance seem to really be directly caused by a pathogen or an infectious agent. But in fact, these are organized and mediated by our own immune systems. And there's a lot of evidence for this, but some evidence for this is that non-infectious stimuli, so psychological stress, which we're all experiencing right now, can induce all of these same behaviors. And we refer to these as sterile inflammatory challenges. So they induce many of the same behaviors, even fevers, for instance. So why does our immune system do this to us? It is because they have, in the short term, adaptive function for the host, for you. So if you're trying to overcome an infection or illness, they help you to recover more quickly or more efficiently. The best example of this is actually fever. So fever is not, of course, a behavior unless you're an animal like a lizard, in which it is. We tend to think of as fever, though, as harmful to us. And there's a lot of stuff in the news right now, of course, about fever. But it is, in fact, much more harmful to the pathogen. This is an incredibly conserved response. You can see this in every vertebrate species and even invertebrate species. So it has been conserved throughout our evolutionary history on Earth because it is, in fact, adaptive. And only when it becomes extremely high or extremely prolonged does it become pathological or harmful to us. So this really brings me to the next point that I'd like to make, which is that what's really interesting for us and many people in my field is that sickness behaviors can really start to resemble changes in behavior that we see in many neuropsychiatric disorders. So anxiety or depression, which once again, you see this sort of very canonical social withdrawal. So it's as if sickness behavior has become prolonged or potentially stuck in this ramping up phase for the immune system, and it never gets properly resolved. And in that case, of course, it becomes pathological and no longer adaptive. So we really try to understand on a cellular and molecular level how this is happening. And so to touch on what two of the previous speakers have already talked about, exercise. We don't study exercise that directly, at least not currently, but exercise is one of the most effective ways to resolve inflammation in the body as well. And so we could talk about that a bit later. But the last thing I wanted to touch on was that another aspect of this that I think is incredibly relevant for what we're all experiencing right now is the very strong evidence that social interactions and specifically social support are profoundly impactful on our resilience to disease via the impact on immune system function. So this is particularly relevant right now because social distancing in many ways breaking these sort of social support mechanisms is occurring at the very time that we need them the most, right? Because this is what's building resilience in our immune system. So I think this sort of conversation is even more relevant to try to understand how can we build resilience in a way that doesn't involve the typical, what social interactions typically look like. So, out there.
Great. Thanks very much, Stacey. I think that's really, all of it is really interesting, and I think we're going to have a lot of fodder for discussion. So we'll move to our last panelist to give her overview, which is Vera Ludwig. And Vera has a diverse background. I'll let her describe her background herself, but I think she sort of wraps up neuroscience and psychology and thinking about positive thinking and wellness altogether.
Thanks. Am I on? Yeah. Okay. Hi everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to this panel. I'm really excited about this topic and about talking to all of you about this. So I'm a postdoc in the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative and working directly with Michael and partly also with Zap. In my past, I've not only been a researcher, but I've also worked as a group coach and a yoga teacher. So I'm trying to kind of bring together science and more applied domains of psychology. And in my opinion, anyway, research, that's my highest value in research somehow, that it should make people's lives better and reduce depression, anxiety, and improve well-being. So I have done research on self-regulation, self-control, flow. I hear some. I'm also interested and have done some work on the role of sexuality actually for well-being. So next to exercise, this is one of the few factors that also reliably correlates with well-being, the frequency and quality of sexual interactions. And of course, that sexual behavior is also interrupted in the current crisis for some people being completely isolated or separated from their partners. And currently, what we're working on in Michael's lab is relationships more generally. So how can we connect with other people? What are the physiological mechanisms mediating that? And we are also currently running some studies on the current situation. So we have several surveys launching now, tapping into different aspects of well-being, like how do people feel right now? How do beliefs about the world change? Do people for example, change their belief that the world is a safe place or that everything has meaning? And how does this relate to psychological problems and moral behavior and social distancing behavior? And maybe one interesting aspect that a little bit links to Stacey's topic is that previous research has also shown that if you have more positive emotional style, that might lead you to, if you're then confronted with a virus, you might have less severe symptoms. And this has been shown for the flu virus and cold virus. And we are looking into this together with the Positive Psychology Center, whether this might also be true for the current for the coronavirus. In that case, we would really recommend to prioritize your well-being, because maybe if you feel good, if you make some time to be happy and to enjoy life, that could even help you reduce symptoms or be less severely affected. And then when I think of well-being, generally, I would say something that Richard Davidson often says, that well-being is a skill. So of course there are some differences in how easily each of us reach a state of happiness or fulfillment. So you can already see those differences in little babies. But it's also a skill. Like you can learn a lot of behaviors and internal skills that can make your life better and more fulfilled. And we can categorize here maybe two domains. So it's behavioral strategies and cognitive and internal strategies. And we've already heard about some of them. So the behavioral ones, like you said, is something like exercising, nutrition, getting enough sleep, also socializing, sexuality, those kind of domains. But then there's also the internal and cognitive strategies. So they relate to emotion regulation, mindfulness, meditation. And I think there's a really huge potential on that side of the equation. And actually the two also interact. Like if you want to motivate yourself to go exercising, you might have to somehow regulate your inner laziness or your blockages to actually start doing the exercise. But I think it's important to also put a focus on those internal skills. And one of them is emotion regulation. We've already heard a bit about that. Matt already mentioned that. And I can just emphasize this point too, that actually a part of emotion regulation is that you also should allow your negative emotions to just unfold. Because if we have a negative emotion like anxiety or anger in the current situation, and we try to just push it away or distract ourselves or drink alcohol or something to immediately get rid of that emotion, then that can actually backfire to some extent, because those emotions have some kind of messenger function for us. Like anxiety and fear is telling us, hey, something is wrong, be careful. And if you're just pushing it away, it will just start screaming more and more. So it might be good to just allow it, to allow yourself to feel it, to express it to other people, and then let it pass. And so let those physiological responses that are associated with those states also disappear. And one last point I want to make about emotion regulation is that you can not only down-regulate negative emotions, you can also up-regulate positive emotions, simply by focusing more on positive aspects of your life. So research has shown that if you have a gratitude diary, for example, so in the evening you take time, you write down just 3 things that were really great that day, Or if you have a partner living with you, then you could ask each other right before going to sleep, hey, what are the 3 things that you are most grateful for today? And research has shown that already after 2 weeks, people are like a lot happier when they do these kind of exercises. Those are some ideas I would contribute.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here. And this is an amazingly apropos topic, and you all bring such amazing strengths and different disciplinary backgrounds to this question. And also, I know, because I know all of you personally, I know that you also practice what you preach. And so that might be really interesting for folks to hear from sort of toward as we move through this discussion. One of the things that occurred to me during your short presentations, talking about happiness, we're talking about wellness, are they the same thing? Is one a component of the other? Which way does the arrow go? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. This is open to all of you, but I'm going to go right to Heather first, because she's thinking about it.
Well, I'm thinking. I think they are not exactly the same thing, but I think they're definitely related. I feel like, our well-being is our sense of self. It's our way of taking care of ourselves. It's a way of increasing how we feel positively in the world through exercise and gratitude and other things as well. And so I feel like our well-being is really partly how we build and develop our happiness. But I could be really happy because I'm falling in love too. And I may or may not be have strong well-being at that time, but I could still have happiness. And so I feel like they're definitely very strongly correlated, but I don't think they're exactly the same thing. That's my very initial thought on a really good question.
Well, how about you, Matt? I mean, you study happiness specifically. Do you think that is distinguishable from well-being or wellness?
It's a good question. So one of the things that a lot of researchers that work in this area kind of think about different dimensions or aspects of well-being, and there's a sizable scientific literature kind of identifying ways in which different dimensions of well-being differ from each other. But if you kind of take that to the extreme, it becomes like too many things to optimize in your objective function. It's like if I'm trying to, maximize 30 different things, how do I do that? And so I've been really curious in my data, like to what extent is there sort of unity in those outcomes versus to what extent is there a lot of sort of separability of those different pieces? And what I find looking kind of in an overarching way at people's lives is that there's a lot of unity. There's kind of an overall signal that is how well life is going. There's a lot of intertemporal variability, so it can go up and down over the course of time, but those things tend to hang together, both in terms of measuring the outcomes and in terms of the kinds of things that give rise to them. Because at the end of the day, as human beings, we can't navigate ourselves based on some outcome measurement. We can navigate in terms of the choices that we would make. And, one possible state of the world is that we would need to make these huge trade-offs between one kind of outcome and another kind of outcome. And by and large, I find that those are exceptions where, things like being physically active, staying, deeply socially connected to other people, managing your sort of, catastrophizing when you're thinking about the state of the world or the state of your own life, all of those kinds of choices will probably, as far as I can tell, be better for most of the dimensions of sort of well-being or happiness and so forth. I guess wellness isn't a term I'm personally quite as familiar with. So I would be cautious about circumscribing kind of what is in and outside of that bubble. But I guess kind of how I interpret it, I mean, almost more as a layperson, is that almost encompasses some of the choices that I'm making as opposed to like well-being outcomes. So someone could kind of be like pursuing wellness by making some of these choices, which might then give rise to well-being as an outcome. But wellness, I guess I interpret as more of kind of a practice than an outcome. But, I would defer to my fellow panelists for an authoritative answer on that.
That's really helpful. I mean, it struck me that there might also be a different time scale to happiness versus well-being, where the happiness it seems like it's something that is happening on a more shorter time scale, and that wellness or well-being is sort of almost like the integral of your moment, happiness and unhappiness, right, that's occurring over the space of hours, days, weeks.
Totally. And I mean, I see that very concretely in my data where different ways of measuring well-being entail basically people are doing that integral. When they answer a question like, overall, how satisfied are you with your life? That is not only highly correlated with the average of how you feel across the moments, but it's basically determined by exactly the kinds of things, same things that shifted upward in the short term. You do those things repeatedly, and those repeated choices add up to something like, an aggregate judgment of how well your life is going.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. Vera, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I would also comment on that. So in positive psychology, there's also this idea that there's overall well-being or flourishing, a flourishing life, and positive emotion is just one aspect of this. And Martin Seligman is very, he really wants to emphasize this a lot, that it's not the same thing, right? Where the goal of all of this is not to always smile and be happy, but rather to live a rich, fulfilling life. And positive emotion is one aspect of it. Others are engagement and flow. So maybe you're really in your work and you're really enjoying, or you're not even enjoying it. You kind of forget everything. You're really in this flow experience. And in that moment, you might not necessarily feel happy. You just have this flow state. Or if you have relationships, you're definitely not always happy because relationships are complicated. And that is also an aspect of well-being, that you have good relationships, meaningful relationships, but that doesn't mean that you're always happy in this relationship, right? So, and then other two components that Martin Seligman, the founder of positive psychology, or one of the founders of positive psychology, is saying is meaning and achievement, similar to what Heather was also describing in her model. So those would all be aspects of well-being, next to physical.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, and I'm glad that you have highlighted Marty's work. I mean, we're here on the University of Pennsylvania campus, where essentially positive psychology was founded, and where he leads the Positive Psychology Center. So everybody on the panel mentioned something related to exercise, that it has demonstrable effects on not only on the health of your body, but on the health of your brain, on mood, on cognitive function. And we also heard a little bit about mindfulness, which we didn't quite dig into yet, which seems to, at least the data is beginning to show kind of some similar kinds of effects. And actually, I'm going to throw this to Stacey, because I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit more about how we think exercise, for example, might actually work to make your brain function better, right, and make your kind of your internal state feel better, and what you might know about, I'm sure you do, whether that operates through similar mechanisms to mindfulness and other kinds of practices like that.
Ooh, yeah. It's hard to study mindfulness in some of my experiments because we're working in preclinical animal models. But I can talk a little bit about what we know exercise does to the immune system, and sort of contrast that with what we know stress does to the immune system. So one of the most fascinating things that stress does is that it essentially is a signal to the immune system to ramp up and prepare for infection, injury, etc. So if you think of this sort of evolutionarily, then we think of it as a signal to send your immune cells out of the barracks, which are, if they're soldiers, they're hanging out in the spleen, they're hanging out in the lymph nodes, etc. And then they pour out of that into the bloodstream and into the skin and into the gut and into the lungs. So all the areas of the body where you would expect to encounter a pathogen, right? So any kind of stressor will do this. And again, in the short term, this is really adaptive, right? Because they're there, they're ready. But if we again think of this evolutionarily, typically the stressors that we encountered in our history were more physical in nature than they are now, right? You were often running away from something or you were running to something to, get your dinner, that sort of thing. And they involved a pretty physical nature. And so you would ramp up, you would prepare for potential injury, immune cells would be recruited, and then you would actually literally run or have some physical activity. And that is a really potent signal for resolution. So once you have endorphins flooding, once you have glucose entering cells, it initiates the recovery phase of that immune cell deployment, right? And then they get recruited back. If you have an injury, of course, then they go to work, right? So if you think about the stressors that we have in our current lives, they're typically very different, right? They tend to be very sedentary. They're just as potent for our brain because you're still interpreting this as a very scary thing. You're not being chased by a tiger, or you're not trying to chase down your dinner, but you are nonetheless experiencing the same sympathetic sort of drive, so all of your immune cells go flooding out to all the parts of the body that they may be needed in, and then they just sit there because there's no resolution, right? So this is why inflammation is linked to everything bad. It's linked to heart disease. It's linked to COPD, pulmonary disorder. It's linked to brain disorders because you've got immune cells hanging out in all of these sort of what we call mucosal barriers of the body, and then they just cause problems because they're secreting cytokines, they're recruiting more immune cells. Then you get plaque buildup in your arteries. You get skin disorders. I mean, every autoimmune disorder you can see is exacerbated by stress. So the stress reaction part is not the bad part. It's the resolution that's not occurring. And exercise on a regular basis, and it doesn't have to be running. I think mindfulness, what's tapping in. So I'm also a yoga teacher, or was for a while, and I do yoga as often as I can. That's one benefit of this, is that I've been doing actually much more than I typically have time for. And I think the mindfulness is basically tapping into that sympathetic response to train it to, essentially turn on the resolution. And so I think that's one thing that's really exciting, is the potential that I noticed somebody wrote in the chat, can we not just talk about running and weightlifting, but gardening and all of these things as well that are adaptive? And I think that's absolutely the case. I don't have data on that. Maybe somebody does, but I think that the data are emerging that one could use mindfulness techniques in a way that's essentially retraining your sympathetic response, and your immune cells go back home.
Thanks. That's super helpful, Stacey, and it makes me think a lot about the concept of homeostasis. That essentially that is what our bodies are constantly trying to achieve, right? Which is to sort of return to some sort of baseline state. So, if things are getting bad and you're not resolving the stress response, you need some way to resolve it and bring your body back to a homeostatic place. But that also kind of presents a challenge too, and we've seen that in the work on mood and in particular happiness, which is that, there's this notion of kind of homeostasis in happiness. Like people win the lottery and they're overjoyed for a week or two, and then they come back, to some whatever their kind of baseline mood is. And if we are trying to kind of incrementally move ourselves upward, how do you do that if, and we know this goes all the way down even to the level, not directly connected here, but to the level of like receptor distributions in the cell membrane in neurons, that everything has a homeostatic dial and a regulator to kind of go back to normal. So Matt, how do you move the needle then if we're programmed for homeostasis?
Yeah, it's a great question and a deep question. So it's completely clear that there is a process which some people would refer to as hedonic adaptation, which is just as you said, something great happens or something terrible happens, and your well-being responds temporarily, and then it tends to, recover to or closer to sort of what the starting point was. And if you take that to an extreme, it sort of says nothing matters because whatever occurs, you'll just sort of end up back where you started. and I think the reality is somewhere in the middle. What I do find, I mean, in thinking through these problems and directly in my data, is that sort of the accumulation of things that move you upward or downward will have cumulative effects. So if I look at the people, everyone's fluctuating all over the place. So if you're looking to sort of achieve a permanent state of happiness, it will never happen. But if you want to sort of shift the range of your variability upward and sort of, increase the fraction of your time that you're spending in a sort of better state of engagement and well-being, making a lot of lower level choices that sort of contribute to that will definitely help. It's just that you have to keep doing them. There's nothing you can kind of do once and then you're done. It's how do I, keep staying engaged with other people? How do I sustain a level of physical activity? How do I find work that is, meaningful and important and feels productive to me? And I feel like is adding something to the world. If you keep doing those things over and over and over, that will have a very positive impact. And I think it highlights a way to think about sort of the pursuit of happiness, or the pursuit of well-being, is really to understand what are the things to which we don't adapt, because that's where the secret is.
Yeah, I think you've hit on something that's really important there, the things to which we do not adapt. And I'd love to maybe dig into that later if we have time. So Heather, did you have a comment?
Yeah, thanks. I love what we're talking about, and I just wanted to tie some of the things we're talking about with homeostasis and exercise and mindfulness together. What Stacey was talking about before is sort of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems in a sense. And our sympathetic nervous system is when the lion is coming after us and our arousal goes off. Everything happens in our body to get us to flight, fight, or flee, or freeze. And the parasympathetic nervous system is what happens when we return to the baseline, to the homeostasis, which really should more be our baseline, but in everyday life with so much stress coming at us, it's not necessarily the case. But exercise can help bring us back there. And mindfulness, there's a lot of research on mindfulness. And mindfulness can either be a formal practice of meditation, mindfulness meditation or other kinds of meditation, or it can be engaging in everyday activities in a mindful way. So eating a meal mindfully, or taking a walk in the present, or even brushing your teeth mindfully. And so these things all help engage our parasympathetic nervous system. And so to talk about what Matt was just saying is the more we engage in these things, studies show that when we engage in mindfulness or mindfulness meditation on a regular basis, it actually changes our brains. It changes our body. It really lowers our levels of depression and anxiety and stress. And so we can be engaging the parasympathetic nervous system more regularly and training our body to be in a place of greater wellness and greater happiness. And so it is very much engaging in the actions that are going to bring us more well-being and wellness that will help us move forward. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I love the concept of mindful eating. It reminds me of what an interviewer once asked the musician Warren Zevon when he was dying of brain cancer, what it had taught him, and he said, enjoy every sandwich. So he really was like eating mindfully, I think, and in that way getting the most out of time. So we also touched on social support and relationships. There's tons of data that show that that's key to getting through rough times, and that the converse, isolation, has an impact on our bodies that is, the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day in terms of morbidity and mortality. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more. Stacey, what do we know? This is something we study in my lab. What do we know about the impact of how does social relationships actually achieve that effect, right? How in the world does that work?
Yeah, that's that's a huge area of research right now. I think more and more in just the role of social circuitry in particular and health. What we know about the immune system is quite a bit. So if you, for instance, do a very simple study with mice in a lab, and you give one mouse a wound in its skin, and you allow that mouse to live with other mice or alone. The mouse that has the wound living alone will take longer to heal. And it's not because the other mice are grooming or things in saliva or etc. It's actually because of oxytocin. So oxytocin injections would do a very similar thing. So social hormones, as we call them, like oxytocin and vasopressin and even the endogenous opioids and a lot of different neuropeptide systems have been linked to changes in the immune system. So immune cells have receptors for practically everything. They have receptors for neurotransmitters, for neuropeptides, for hormones. They can produce many of these things. So it's actually a really sophisticated conversation that happens between the immune system and the nervous system at all times. And so that's just one example. There's a lot of really fascinating data on this. Some of the strongest literature is in the cancer literature, as well as HIV. So social support does not predict your chance of being diagnosed with either cancer or HIV, but it strongly predicts your prognosis, so the progression of the disease. So the stronger social support you have, basically, the better you're able to survive these what can be very chronic health conditions, of course. Yeah, so I could go on. I mean, it's a huge area of research, but we know more and more about the molecular basis of this now, which I think is really exciting because it moves it from the sort of, again, the nebulous sort of like, we think maybe this works, to really trying to understand at the cellular level that these associations are very real.
I think what you brought up in terms of the mechanism is really important and gets back to something Heather talked about in the very beginning, which is that our social lives are now occurring through the two sensory channels, and those are pretty impoverished, and we are in particular missing touch. And as you well know, in the past couple of decades, it's been discovered that we have specialized receptors in our skin that are maximally responsive to social touch, the touch of another human being. So it's maximal at body temperature, and it's sort of that slow stroking of the hairy parts of your skin, and that seems to, at least in animals, it releases oxytocin in the brain, which, again, as you said, not only impact the way our brains function, but interact with the immune system. So I don't know how we replace that. I think that's going to be.
Well, one thing I would say to that is, one encouraging thing, at least, is that in those same rodent studies where they did the wound healing rates in isolated animals versus group housed, they were very interested in whether this was simply a licking and grooming thing, because saliva has all kinds of wonderful magical things in it, and it helps us to heal, and that's why all animals lick their wounds. So they did the same experiment with a little mesh in between, so the animals couldn't actually touch each other, and it still worked. So but they could smell each other. They were still in close proximity, but they weren't able to huddle or cuddle each other or lick and groom each other, and it still had the same effect. So, maybe some hope for us during this time.
Zab, are you signaling that it's time to get to some questions from the?
It is indeed. I mean, I've been monitoring them, and a lot of people, I think, have gotten their answers directly, which is fantastic. But we're happy to take additional questions. So keep those. Please do keep those coming. I know we don't have very long, but I think this idea of gratitude and well-being, Vera, you sort of touched on that. I wondered if you could sort of bring that a bit into the fore, again, not just about exercise, but what we know from that side of things,
from mindfulness, etc. Yeah. Yeah, so I still wanted to comment a bit on this hedonic adaptation that Matt mentioned, that we tend to get used to the new happiness state we're in, or like if our lives get better. And I would say that if you practice mindfulness, just like Heather said, or certain contemplative techniques, you can actually learn to avoid this hedonic adaptation effect. Like there are meditation techniques described in some contemplative traditions that are really focusing on for example, you bring some memory into your mind of a very beautiful event that might also be a social event. So maybe for people who are socially isolated right now, I read someone who said they are struggling with this right now, and you're definitely not the only one. There's some meditation techniques that involve imagining some beautiful social with someone and really bringing back the emotions that you had at the time. And I can really confirm from my own experience that this will actually not adapt. Like you will even learn to get happier and happier every time you do this exercise. So I think this hedonic adaptation doesn't have to always hold if you really train your mind to pay attention. And with the exercise, I would also say there's also mindful exercise. And we have this paper coming out now that's going to talk about that. That actually forcing yourself to do exercise in a way that is very achievement oriented, that might actually be negative in some ways and can have some negative effects. But if you do it in a way that you really pay attention to how good it makes you feel, you choose something that you like dancing or whatever it is, and then you pay attention to the positive effects like Matt has described, which it has, right? And you really, after you come home exercising, you really enjoy this feeling of the exercising. That might make it more likely that you will exercise again instead of forcing yourself and struggling. So
this is a thank you. This is a perfect segue before we have to wrap things up. I always love to ask our guests what they're doing. What are you doing to deal with the new challenges in our environment? In what ways does your science or practice that you do, how do you translate that into your own life? This is open to everybody.
Okay. I'll just go quickly in first. It's been really important for me to keep a routine. So I'm waking up around the same time each morning. I'm exercising most days of the week, sometimes lifting, sometimes walking, or doing high intensity interval training in a park as much as possible. So I try to get outside. And I meditate most days. That's been really helpful as well. And eating well. And my husband and I try to take a walk together most days of the week. And that's just been a really nice ritual we've developed as this has been going on. And it's just nice time to connect. It's nice to be outside. It's nice to be away from all our screens. So that's been really, those have been really important sort of on a day-to-day basis, just trying to keep my day, controlling what I can within my day in a way to support my well-being the best I can. And trying to plan things to look forward to, even though that's a little challenging right now.
That's great. Anybody else? Matt?
I mean, something I've kind of enjoyed about the current situation. So, in some cases, having a situation that's more constrained also can give you sort of more creativity in a sense. And so I've been enjoying kind of thinking about how do I have actually, in some ways, more freedom to do things than I did before. There are lots of things that I can't do, but then it leaves time for everything that's left. So, I mean, just to pick one example, I mean, I've been trying to have a protected time for writing every morning where I won't look at my phone, I won't look at my computer. And the more kind of days I'm able to do in the row, it becomes sort of a more peaceful part of the day that I really look forward to. In the normal course of life, there are too many things going on to be able to kind of that robustly ignore everything else. But I think that's one of the nice aspects about this time. Another thing that I've experienced, and I've also talked to a lot of people who've taken advantage of this, is, now that we can't see anyone in person, people who are far away are just as close as people who are nearby. So, you mentioned having a happy hour the other night with some of your friends, Michael. I did that. Last night. I did that with some friends of mine from college, and I mean, honestly, we had almost as much fun, playing cards and everything else that was happening over a video call as we would have had in person, but we're all over the country, so we couldn't have done that under normal circumstances, but now we can, and it's actually great. So I think just kind of thinking about like what would be fun and interesting to do, or, start a new hobby or do a new thing that you just wouldn't have the opportunity to do otherwise. This could actually be a nice time in some ways.
Awesome. Stacey?
Yeah, quickly. I already mentioned I've really started to have a much more rigorous yoga practice, which I've been doing yoga for 20 years, but it has ebbed and flowed, and so I've been really embracing that. And similarly, I'm taking yoga classes from teachers, my favorite teachers from all over the place, from Boston and from Cambridge, UK, where I lived for a year. And it's just delightful. Like I never would have had this chance, but I can actually take classes from people all over. And also the similar thing of really connecting with family and friends, actually more than I have in years, which must be a good thing. Yeah, I mean, that said, I will admit that I definitely have, I have hard days. And I think that one of the most powerful things that mindfulness has taught me over the years is that nothing is permanent. And so this idea that even when you're having a really bad day, that it's going to probably change. So and if you're having a really good day, it's probably going to change, but nothing is permanent. So it's just this sort of like recognizing that you need to sort of, go with the ebb and the flow. And that's the most sort of helpful for me to think about.
Yeah, those are all really important. I'd love it if you'd share with me your favorite yoga teacher. I need some new connections. Yeah,
she'll DM you off list. Yeah, we don't want to look like we're endorsing anybody.
Well, of course. Vera, any last words?
Yeah, just quickly. I do like meditation each day, so I like to do music meditation. So mindfulness can be a bit exhausting sometimes. I'd still recommend it, but you can do music meditations. You do 20 minutes amazing music and really let yourself fall into that. I sometimes put on music and dance around my apartment, maybe a bit embarrassing, but it's really good. And just take the situation as it is and see some advantages in it as a contemplative retreat.
Yeah, I think what's really great about where we are, science, is that there's enough there to really say that this stuff is real. Right? All the things we're talking about doing, it's real, it's validated, we understand about the mechanism. People have been practicing some of these things. So I think that's a real endorsement. Above and beyond the fact that it feels good and it seems like it works, there's a real biology to it too. So if you had to select from a menu of things, I think these things, exercise, mindfulness, relationships, are really good ones if you're going to put your time and energy into it.
Great. Well, another fantastic panel. As one of our guest attendees said, they could listen to us all day long, which I think is really flattering. And we won't make anybody do that in this context. But if you have ideas for future sessions, please do write to us and questions. We're trying to put together our weekly sessions. We will again have the next two are confirmed. Next week's is now on the Wharton Neuroscience calendar. So, and we'll be sending out more words on that. But thank you to all of our panelists and our attendees. It's really fantastic to have you all here and joining us.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.